This is section 4.3, one-to-one and inverse functions. All right, so inverse functions, the x and y's are swapped. And I don't believe we actually have any one-to-one functions in this section. All right, so let's look at this. We need to determine if f of x and g of x are inverses. There's a way to do algebraically, but I'm just going to go ahead and show you how to find the inverse. So we're going to take f of x, and f of x is just another way to write y. So the first thing you want to do is swap x and y. And then solve for y. All right, so we need to solve for y, so let's move the 23 first. And let me move this over, just to give myself a little more room. All right, and to get rid of the cube on the y, you're going to take the cube root of both sides. So this is the inverse of f of x. So if we go back here and look at what they gave us g. And again, this is a video, so you can pause this if you need to slow it down. It is not exactly the same. I have x plus 23. For our inverse, we got x minus 23. So that means f and g are not inverses. All right, so this gives us f and f inverse. Now this notation here, f to the minus 1, that means inverse. That's our inverse notation. So what happens with the inverse, the ordered pairs, the x and y's are swapped. So for instance, in the original function, we have a point at -1, -12. So on the inverse of that function, we have a point at -12, -1. Again, the x and y's are swapped. So if this x is 0, the corresponding y is the -9, because this is the x of the inverse, so it's the y of the original function. So that's going to be -6, -3, and 0. This is the easiest way to do this. I mean, you could plug in 0, get your x, and then plug in, find the inverse, and then plug this stuff in. But it's easier just to flip everything. So 0, 1, 2, and 3. So again, if you look at them as ordered pairs, we have 0, -9, and for the inverse, -9, 0. All right, this one wants you to find the inverse. F of x is just another way to write y. First thing we need to do is swap our x and y's. And then solve for y. So we start by adding 3 to both sides. Put that up here just for the sake of room. Last step to get y by itself is to divide out the 10. So the inverse is the x plus 3 over 10. So they want to know, do the values for F inverse in the provided table fit the equation? Okay. So we're going to use the second table because that's the table for F inverse. We're going to go through and plug in those values. So we're going to plug in -3. So it gives me 0 on top. 0 divided by 10 is 0. That one matches. Plug in a 7. That gives me 10 over 10, which is 1. Let's plug in a 17. So that's 20 over 10, which gives me 2. Again, a 27 gives me 30 over 10, which is a 3. And then finally we end up with 40 over 10, which gives me a 4. So yes, they do fit into the equation. So this one, it looks a little complicated, but it's not. All right, so we have the inverse. That's an x and a y. Has a point at -6, 10. So that means the original function has a point at 10, -6. So they want you to find h of 10. That's the original function. 10 is your x. So the corresponding y value is going to be the -6. So we have an inverse. It's our x and y. So it has a point at 5, 0. So that means the original function will have a point at 0, 5. Again, x and y's are just swapped with the inverse. So they want us to find f of 0. 0 is our x. So our corresponding y value is going to be 5. All right, we need to find the inverse of this. So we start off with f of x is the same thing as y. We're going to swap our x and our y's and then solve for y. All right, now to solve for y here, I need to get y out of the bottom. So I'm going to multiply both sides through by y. All right, those cancel out top to bottom. You're left with 7. And on the left, you have x times y, which is xy. Again, we need to get y by itself. So we're going to divide x out on both sides. So the inverse is 7 over x. So the inverse is the same as the original function, and that's okay. That happens sometimes. So let's look at our next one. G of x is y. All right, so we're going to swap x and y. And then solve for y. I'm going to start by moving the 5 to the left. And our last step to get y by itself is to divide out the -7. Well, I guess that would be a g. So the inverse of g is x minus 5 over -7. Find the inverse of this equation for x is greater than 0. And I'm going to show you what that means at the end. So again, the first thing is to swap your x and y's. And then solve for y. Let's divide out the 144. There's a couple ways you can approach this. Then to get rid of the square, you're going to take the square root of both sides. So on this one, on the bottom, the square root of 144 is 12. And the square root of x is just square root of x. Technically, it should be plus and minus, plus or minus. But because it says x is greater than or equal to 0, you're just going to leave it like this. So the inverse is the square root of x over 12. Same thing here for x is greater than 0. Swap our x and y's. And solve for solve for y. So add 3 to both sides first. And here's the other thing. This negative needs to go away, so we're going to have to divide both sides through by -1, which just changes the signs. We need it to be positive before we take the square root of both sides. So the inverse square root of -x minus 3. We are done with section 4.3.